Welcome to Regulate Tech. This is the 22nd episode of our podcast. And it's with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad. And
with me, Richard Allan.
So one of the things that we haven't talked a lot about is the pandemic. And we haven't talked about the pandemic because the pandemic doesn't obviously lead you to think about tech policy except for misinformation. We did discuss it when we talked about the code of conduct for misinformation. But I think there are other impacts of the pandemic that are also interesting. And you have mentioned and thought some about what the pandemic means for the workplace, for our work environment, the daily relationship we have with work. What do you think is happening there?
Yeah, I think what's happened is that something that was relatively normal for people like you and I, but you and I being a very, very small minority of the population, that's people who work in global tech companies, that what was sort of normal for us in terms of our workplace has actually now become normal for a much wider group of people. And that's raising all sorts of questions. So when I talk about what that means you're working from anywhere with a group of people who could be anywhere. And importantly, you may be asked to join in with things at any time. And typically you're doing that using video conferencing has become the kind of primary means. And I think that's been actually, again, the norm. I certainly, in my life over the last 5 or 6 years, was to be on video conferencing calls 5 or 6 hours a day. And that was like perfectly normal with people in Europe, people in the United States and so on. And so that sort of abnormal normality, shall we say, that normality for a very small subset of people working for very leading edge global tech companies now has sort of spread across the workplace. And it's raising questions, I say, about all sorts of things, ranging everything from kind of the extent to which workplace employers can surveil you, can see what you're doing online, through to how you use those tools for purposes other than strictly your work purposes. And then very importantly, through to what are your rights as an employee? To what can your employer demand of you in this new workplace? And should those demands be different from the old demands in a more conventional or traditional workplace setting?
It's interesting because this is a part of the labor contract that we haven't really negotiated, because as you say, it's a very small subset who has been on video conferences all the time and also enjoyed the luxury of that extra time zone at the end of your usual workday, where you got an extra workday because all of the people in California woke up. I think that the reality is that this is unnegotiated ground, and it's certainly something that people have strong feelings about, because this idea that you should always be accessible, that you should be 24/7 available to your employer, it sort of flies in the face of the increased focus on self-realization, on family, on distinct personal space and personal sphere vis-a-vis work. I mean, we've been talking about work-life balance for the longest time now, and it's a fraught concept. There are a lot of problems with it, but it seems as if that work-life balance piece is just waiting to become an issue in tech policy, doesn't it?
It does, and I don't know about you, but we would do these regular surveys when I used to work at Facebook on work-life balance, and the question, is always answered that it's pretty disastrous. But as a qualifier, it didn't used to come up as the thing that was most important to people. So even though they recognized it was terrible, it was most important. And I think, again, let's be really entirely candid, people who are in very well-paid, very interesting jobs.
Yeah.
Tend, even though they don't like the work-life balance, they tend not to see it as disastrous. People who are in much less well-paid jobs where it's more onerous, where the work is not fun, it's just hard daily grind. I think for them it's a much, much bigger deal. So we should calibrate it that work-life balance, say, can be a complaint that isn't, if I say, sort of critical or fatal to your enjoyment of a job, or it can be something that, I say, really, really grinds and gets you down. Having said all that, even for people who are saying, look, I'm well paid, I'm interested in my job, it's not fatal, having the wrong work-life balance over time, I think, can be very detrimental. And I would say that personally, it was something I felt, even though I loved my job and I was really interested and really well rewarded, there comes a certain point at which you are damaging relationships and you're just exhausted. So there's sort of classic sort of burnout syndrome that people talk about. But that's what it does come down to. It's both, literally how much time is your job absorbing, and then how do you feel about that amount of time, and how you feel about it is going to vary according to how well you're compensated and how interesting the work is to you personally.
And I want to make another point here that I think is important, because we have to approach this from several different angles. And I think you're right that in the modern organization, when you have a job, it's harder and harder to keep up work-life balance. But there's a difference here, because what's happening is that there are a lot of people in the labor market who don't necessarily have a job. They don't have that bundle of social status or retirement or benefits, because their work is atomized. It's divided up into labor that's on demand. So it's sometimes we refer to it as the gig economy, et cetera, et cetera. And there it seems even harder to think about what work-life balance means, because there it's these isolated components of work that you have to grab if you want to make money. And so there's another really interesting push now where labor law and tech policy are converging, where there are questions being asked whether or not these people who are on-demand gig workers should also be enshrined in the architecture that we developed over hundreds of years for jobs between trade unions and employers associations, etc. So there seems to be another angle in which tech policy is also affecting the very nature of jobs and sort of splintering them, fragmenting them into the work components that usually are bundled. And that creates an entirely different set of problems, doesn't it?
It does. And I think that's part of something that tech companies like. So it's not, again, exclusive to tech. This idea of sort of piecework is, again, not new. And there are some real issues. One of our other favorite words, I think, Nicklas, is agency, isn't it? There are some agency. Yes. There's some really, really sort of profound questions about that sense of, how much, to the extent to which you feel you have agency, or others are playing you, and you're utterly dependent on them. And I think one of the sort of very significant aspects of the gig economy is that lack of agency, that you are sitting there sort of waiting to be told when to come into work and what to do, as opposed to having agency or control over it yourself. But as I say, the piecework piece isn't new. I think where it has become exaggerated with tech companies is that one of the things that tech companies like to do is to have a light footprint. In other words, to sort of contract out everything they possibly can. So we should look at it in the round. It's not just that, an Uber has sort of come from nowhere and said our model is to have, workers who are not employed. The idea of an Uber or tech company is that they want to employ as few people as possible, just some software engineers typically, and then everything else is contracted out. So you'll contract out pensions and all sorts of stuff that you can push out that a traditional business would have had in-house. A tech business will typically have out externally. And so sort of in a sense, it's kind of a logical follow-on from that model of, a small number, typically of sort of highly technical employees at the center, and then a large body of people providing contracted in services to sort of extend that even further to the actual service that you're delivering to the public.
Well, it's not true for all tech companies, though. I mean, if you look at Amazon, it's interesting because Amazon has really leaned into hiring hundreds of thousands of people and become a ginormous employer, not just in the US, but in Europe as well. So they seem to be taking a different approach, but they're also dependent. Logistics is a core function in Amazon. What you describe are not core functions in tech companies. So many companies, and not just tech companies, I think if you go to your Procter & Gamble or if you go to your AstraZeneca, I think you will find that what is not core is usually, this is the outsourcing discussion that we've been having since 1980s, essentially. And I think the problem with that is that I think that tech companies are extraordinarily efficient at it, which means that they can measure everything and they can get the most out of it. Outsourcing that is a little bit lax at the edges is probably okay because it creates great jobs on the other side of the outsourcing. Outsourcing that sort of really measures everything might just shave off those margins a bit and make those outsourced jobs a little bit less attractive, perhaps.
Yeah, so I think you're right. It is that the outsourcing, and part of it, I think it's not actually necessarily about costs, but it's about flexibility. It's about a company saying, "Look, we're going to develop in this direction, and we think we'll need 5,000 people to do it." But if there are full time employees, particularly in countries around the world where employment rights are strong, and you decide to go in a different direction, you then, from a company point of view, are stuck. That's a horrible word, but stuck with a whole bunch of employees who you no longer need. And so, of course, the outsourcing model would say, I'll stop that contract and move to a different model, and it's not my responsibility; it's the responsibility of whoever employs those outsourced contractors. So, in some cases, it can actually cost more money, but what you get for that additional money, at least from the company's perspective, is an additional amount of flexibility. And if you look at the models for content moderation, something we have discussed on this podcast, you'll find that a lot of companies use content moderation outsource providers because they suddenly have a need for 500 Arabic speakers or 1,000 Turkish speakers or 300 Russian speakers, and they don't know how long they'll need those people to do that work. And so in many cases, it may end up costing them more. It would be cheaper to hire the employees in to the company. But if you hire them in and then your needs change next year, then they say that responsibility falls on you with the outsourced provider. Hopefully, if you don't need those 500 Turkish speakers, one of the other customers of the outsource provider will need them, and so they can divert them to other work. So a lot of it, I think, is about the flexibility that at least people perceive they get from the outsourcing.
And I think you would probably get a rather strong argument from many of the politicians that we have met who would say that this is actually a core function of a platform. And in order to sort of think about this in the right way, you should hire these people and not outsource them, because this is, and I think the companies, on the other hand, are coming at this from this, we're doing this in response to political pressure. It doesn't feel like a core function. So sometimes it's really hard to know what a core function is and whether or not the core function of platforms is content moderation. My suspicion would be, given, and there's a specific set of workplace issues for the people who are employed in these sometimes gruesome jobs where they have to watch images and sort of take down content that is horrible in many ways. I think that the overall trend, my guess would be that more of these will be in-house in 10 years than today.
I think a combination of in-house and actually potentially quite a lot of automation, which is the other thing, obviously, that's hanging over all of this. That, again, from a actually a human perspective, if you can use artificial intelligence systems or clever image matching to get rid of the worst of the worst and not have any human look at it, then that feels like a much better outcome. And so, again, I think a lot of the companies are working towards that goal, which again drives them towards saying, well, we don't want to invest too much in hiring a bunch of people who we may be displacing ourselves through technology in a few years' time. And so, again, that's, I think, a critical part of the calculation. And arguably, some of the transport providers who are also investing in self-driving vehicles, you can see there perhaps a similar dynamic going on where they've got an eye to the future where they perhaps don't need employees as such.
And it's an interesting observation. It's like you have this human transition period where you expect that you will need human work, but at the end of that, you expect to be able to automate a lot of that. So you need to find a path to the point of automation, and that path is then hiring all of these people, and then getting to the point of automation, having to lay them off would be painful in so many different ways. And so you're right, there's a reticence that comes from the promise of automation in the future, not just automation happening now. And that reticence is not, it's not in hiring people, it's rather in the forms in which you're hiring them, if you're outsourcing or if you're hiring as full-time employees. Now, I want to get back to the question. You mentioned something that I think is really important earlier, where you said that the question of work-life balance is essentially a question of our individual autonomy vis-a-vis our employers. The ability to sort of decide and shape our own lives and our leisure time, our personal time, our family time in ways that are not impacted by an always-on mentality. And this autonomy, this requirement of autonomy is underlies a lot of thinking that is happening, I think, primarily right now in Europe, around how to regulate this, how to sort of get to a stable state. And there are two big models here, it seems. There's the French model and the German model. Can you walk us through what the French are doing?
So essentially, they have created a legal right to disconnect, which essentially says as part of the arrangement between an employer and an employee, they have to agree on what the normal hours are within which people are going to communicate, and they have to agree that outside of those hours, the employee literally has a right not to be communicated with, and actually that the employer potentially gets into trouble if they step outside of that agreement. I mean, it's sort of in sense is regarded as kind of abusive behavior for an employer to be seeking to connect with their employees outside of that agreed framework. And there's a set of rules around that and guidance and ways in which those agreements need to take place. But I say the heart of it is that notion, this right to disconnect, is saying, I mean, it's you can argue it's a right to disconnect, or it's a forbidding of connection. So you can flip it the other way around and say at one level it's saying, if you're a reasonable employer / manager, then for you to step outside of something is almost kind of like harassing behavior or inappropriate sort of workplace behavior. And it's based on an assumption that, and again, this is interesting, we sort of tease this out, of a sort of, in the sense of passive employee and an aggressive employer, that the employer is trying to extract the maximum from this employee, and therefore you've got to redress the balance by creating a sort of regulatory framework which says, look, the employee potentially could seek action, damages against their employer if they did step out of line and engage in that sort of almost harassing behavior, inappropriate workplace behavior by communicating when they shouldn't.
No, it's a model that goes back to Marx, right? The idea is that you are essentially extracting labor from your employees, and the way you extract that needs to be regulated, or you are going to be tempted to over-extract labor because that's in the nature of the employment relationship. There's and the interesting thing is that when you contrast this with the German model, the Germans are instead employing self-regulation between the social partners on the labor market. The idea being that, instead of regulating this, there are agreements between companies and labor unions that are essentially setting out the rules for disconnection. And this is being driven to a large part by the employers, with the motivation that they don't believe in working all day round. They believe in efficiency. So we go to sort of our cultural stereotypes here, right? We have the Germans who are saying, of course, you have a right to disconnect. You just need to work efficiently. And if you work efficiently, you should be able to. And this is from a paper I read about this that I thought was hilarious. It was by a guy called Paul Secunda, who wrote that the Germans essentially are subscribing to the theory of work hard, play hard.
Yes.
So rather than work 24 hours a day, which is the US theory, he asserted. And so in Germany, it's a self-regulatory model between the social partners of the market, driven by a sense that if you're working nonstop and if you're not disconnecting, then you're not working in the right way and you're not efficient. I thought that was really interesting, and sort of a contrast between approaches. Both seem to lead to the same conclusion, that there should be this right to disconnect, but they're motivated in a power relationship in France and in an efficiency framework in Germany. Again, according to Paul Secunda. I do think he has a point there. I don't know what you think. Yeah, the stereotyping is dangerous.
It is dangerous. But I think the Irish have gone for something similar to the German model in the sense it's sort of guidelines and agreement. So I think a lot of countries are interested, and we will get this spectrum. And although it's stereotyping, but it will. I mean, we see it in other areas. There's no reason to think this will be different from the sort of health and safety guidance type approach, which arguably is more common in what they normally call the Anglo-Saxon countries, but it's sort of Nordic and UK, Ireland type countries where you tend to sort of have a more of a guidance-led approach. In Germany, yes, a lot of their workplace regulation is done through this sort of agreement between all of the stakeholders model. Much more common, the Works Council agrees something type model. And in France, in other areas as well, things like working time in other areas, again, much more common, that there'll be formal regulation. So I think we'll see this sort of follow the route that other areas of workplace rules follow. But you're right, the common thread in all of them it is a desire not to just ignore this, not just to leave it as entirely a matter for each company to sort out for themselves, but to establish norms. And those norms, I say, will be expressed differently in each country, but the norm they're trying to establish is that there are limits to the number of hours on which somebody should be on duty, and that they shouldn't have to respond. It's often focused very, very specifically on email. And actually, some of the rules are, you must reconfigure your email services so they don't send emails out at certain times. When you get into a real rule-based system, it's like you've got to go into typically your Microsoft Exchange server and kind of configure it so that it stores all the messages and doesn't send them on to individual recipients between such and such an hour and such an hour. I mean, you can really sort of get into the fine-grained detail. But the notion of all of it is, yes, that very commonly you should not be emailing, messaging, calling people for a certain number of hours each day. To be decided within each business, but that's really at the heart of it. And I think a lot of countries are going to end up precisely in that space where, either through formal law or through some kind of guidance, they're trying to create these new norms.
And as they do so, they're sort of reintroducing the friction of the old office, where you didn't have access to any of your work resources, etc. And you've said this a couple of times now. You talked about the hours we work, the working hours and time. But is that really the nature of modern work, though? That we're talking about hours? I think there are two things going on here. One is work, which I think is less and less well measured by time, and the other is accessibility, where you're turned into this resource that I can request things from, or that I can ask things, or that I can ping things. And it's interesting because I think most people like the ability to plan their work and perhaps take 2 days, two hours off in the workday and go off and do something because they can complete their work task in the afternoon. So it's not so much about regulating working hours as regulating this new thing that has happened, which is that there's this accessibility. There's this, you become a resource in some way. I mean, Heidegger would have a field day with this, because he's saying that technology turns us all into resources. It turns a forest into wood. And this is essentially now happening with people. You're turning people into sort of pingable resources. So I can ping you every hour if I want to. And that has done something to you. But it isn't exactly about work, is it?
No, so a lot, I think, is about the volume and type of tasks that you're being asked to do. So again, I think very privileged people like yourself and myself are at the one end of the spectrum, where essentially your job, in a sense, is a vocation. You're dedicated to it. You find it interesting, I say, and you kind of live within that work environment where you don't feel particularly put upon when new stuff comes in. In fact, you can feel quite excited. I need it. Off I go. I'm going to kind of charge out and try and resolve this issue. And we should be really candid. There are a certain number of workers who are lucky enough to be in that place most of the time. And I'm not going to pretend I wasn't. There's another group of workers where it's task focused, and they do like that flexibility. So again, your sort of classic, self-employed electrician who is given a job with a price, and the job is to come and fit 20 electrical sockets in a house, and they're going to get that money to do those 20 electrical sockets, and it's, from their point of view, a fair price. And if they choose to do that late in the evening or on a Saturday morning or in the middle of the day, kind of, it's nice for them to have that flexibility, because they're going to get paid the right amount for the right job. But then there's a much bigger bucket of workers, and this is where I think the real concern is, where essentially the tasks they're not being paid per task. It's not work that they're necessarily sort of choosing to do for fun. It is hard grind. And then the fear is that by extending the amount of time you're asking for them, essentially you're devaluing their work. So if you're paying them for 5 hours, as an employer, that you're trying to extract effectively 7 hours of work out of them while still paying them 5. That's where I think you hit the real problem. That's where there is a real unfairness. And as I say, that can happen where the tasks aren't clearly defined, and they're not getting paid per task. And if they're not getting paid per hour. So in the old model, if you were paid 9 to 5, you turned up at the office 9 to 5, that was fair. You left, you switched off, you were getting paid your 8 hours. Now, if you leave the office at 5 and you're getting pinged at 6 and 7 and 8 in the evening, but you're still getting paid for the 9 to 5, arguably you're being paid less. Your work has been devalued because now you're working more hours to do the same amount of work. And I think underlying that is a view, and this sort of may reflect as well the times that we're in, that I think more and more employers have sort of more work on than their employees can possibly deliver. And they're not hiring up. So again, in the old world, where everyone was in these sort of fixed workplaces, if you want to take on more work, you hired more employees. The perception today is that you take on more work, but you try and stretch your existing employees to cover it. So again, you end up in this situation where people are doing more work for the same money. And that, I think, is at the heart of these complaints and the heart of this sort of notion of right to switch off, that there is an unfairness in expecting people to do more work for less money. And that happens where this working day is extended beyond where it used to be, but there's no additional pay given.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's right. And it makes me think that many years ago I read about, so Hannah Arendt has this interesting distinction in her work. She speaks about labor, which is funkable, and sort of what you just mentioned. It's non-task specific. It's just you grind and you work. And then she had work, which was completed tasks, where you do something that ends up being something. It can be artistic work, but it can also be carpentry, which is artistic, I suppose, and other things. But it has sort of a task defined. And then there's action. Action is where sort of your life and your work, they melt together, and what you're doing is essentially shaping your world around you. And I think one of the things that has happened is that it's become much worse to be in the lowest Hannah Arendt category, labor, because labor can be drawn upon by multiple different channels all the time. So that's where the protective need is the greatest. But for people who still have the ability to engage in work, or even better in action, are privileged to do that, this may not be as much of a thing for them. But I do think, I mean, but maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's wrong, because I think that the other question here is, how should we relate to work? Should we? What is if we can work all day round, if we can be accessible all day round? How did you deal with this on a personal level as a manager? What was your philosophy when you talked to your teams?
Yeah, so I mean, you need to be careful, and you need a lot of sort of clear communication. Again, this may be part of how this is addressed. So, for example, if you're like me, the kind of person who needs to email something as soon as they think of it, not because you want someone to do anything about it, but because otherwise you're going to forget. Again, you need to establish explicit norms that say, I'm going to send you the email, but you can ignore it. Or, I mean, that's one way of doing it. Or if the person you're sending it to, though, is the kind of conscientious person who doesn't feel comfortable ignoring it, again, you need to surface that and say, look, you sending it to me, even when you write, don't do anything about this, you've actually disturbed my evening, because now I'm worrying about it. I can't ignore it as the recipient. So I say, for me, the critical thing is that communication. It's understanding between people who are working together, on what basis they're communicating with each other. How do they individually react to different forms of communication? And as I say, I think a lot of issues can be resolved by those direct communications between managers and people in their teams, but they involve compromises. So again, my position, I may be the kind of person that likes to fire the thing off by email. I may get frustrated if I can't. But a compromise for an employee who doesn't like those emails sitting in their inbox is for me to hold back, to stick it in my drafts folder, and risk the fact that I'll forget to send it the next day. But that's the kind of compromise that you sometimes need to reach. So really honest, open communication about how you are each experiencing different work patterns, I think, is the key to certainly at a micro level within a team being able to address this.
And trying to also figure out where you're falling for that trap of fake urgency. that so often happens in organizations of all sizes, I think, where you sort of, oh, this has to be done now, and you email somebody on a Saturday, although it doesn't really have to be done on a Saturday. And it's interesting because the general pace of society is speeding up so much that we end up feeling urgency almost like a background noise. And so we end up expecting responses very quickly. We end up sending emails. I started to use very late in my career this function within Gmail that allows you to delay sending of the email, which I think is a good tip. If you're using Gmail, and obviously you should. This is not a plug from my former employer. If you're using Gmail or any other email service, I think most have it now. It's actually possible to delay your emails over the weekend and actively design your work patterns, not just sort of lay them out and accept them, but design them to set an example. And I think it's really hard because, but it's a trap, and I think most people fall into this, that you say you don't have to read the email, but then you're working with tremendously helpful, conscientious people who are sort of like, oh, I know I don't absolutely, and here's the response. Yeah. I remember this happening many times. I did exactly like you described, and after a while sort of just started not to send the emails because nobody would sort of adapt to this notion that you can look at it Monday.
Yeah. Well, also if you've written, you had to read 5 paragraphs explaining about this really serious problem before you get to the closing line, which says no need to respond to this. The damage is done because your head is full of this problem and it's going to haunt you, for the rest of the weekend. So, I mean, one thing that I find interesting, because we've talked about it for years, and I go all the way back before I worked at Facebook. I used to work at Cisco, and Cisco used to talk about unified communications and people being able to express their communications preferences. And again, remarkably, I think underdeveloped as a sort of model for people organizing work. So which channels do you prefer? When do you prefer them? These are really quite important questions. One thing that I have as a personal habit is I prefer voice telephony as a channel for a lot of things because I find it really annoying.
Amen to that.
Having sent emails back and forth, particularly if you have 3 or 4 questions. Hey, when's this thing happening? The email back telling you when it's happening. Okay, who's going to go to it? Email back. We could be 6 emails in before you got the information that I could have got in a 1-minute phone call. So I would phone people up, but they would freak out because from their perspective, the phone was the thing you picked up, when some serious urgent tragedy has happened. And from their point of view, it is different. Instant messaging now on the scene, again, I think for a lot of us, you find that you start, for anything important, you start ignoring email and instant messaging, or you send an instant message going, please look at your email that I just sent. So, again, we need to surface all of this and understand what the rules of engagement are. And there isn't a single pattern. Some organizations could be, we want everything on email for all sorts of reasons. We want it to be documented for legal purposes. We want to go a little bit slower. Other organizations could be like, get the hell off email, unless you're sending some formal document, and please do everything on instant messenger. And other organizations, again, if I was running one, would be much more pick up the phone and talk to each other. But let's get all that out, I think, is a really important step that is missing a lot of organizations where people are, well, you can imagine them sending endless chains of emails complaining about how people are using email and nobody ever sitting down and talking about it.
I think this happens a lot, and I think it's interesting because in many ways, what we've done is also that we have intellectualized work. So more and more work is knowledge work, but we still think in communication as if we're sending physical things back and forth, and we're looking at working hours, as we said before. One of the things you said just now, the notion of sort of this sitting in your head, I think is so important because a lot of the work that we do is about how we allocate our attention. And I think this is true for most knowledge workers, which means that if you send a Friday afternoon email about a enormous problem and saying, but don't worry about it over the weekend, it's impossible not to worry about it over the weekend. So in a sense, work has become more and more about how we allocate our attention and how we allocate the attention of the people working with us. And it is much, much harder than than telling somebody to disconnect when they're going home from a bookstore that they worked in, or if they've sort of worked with something much more hands-on. So there's inherent, I think, in modern work this problem as well, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, because the reply to it seems to be to build more and more tools, and those tools absorb more and more attention. And I was fascinated to see that there are now companies who are talking about looking at Zoom statistics or Microsoft Teams statistics to get a sense for how many people are actually working, and how much are they working, and how much has this person been on Zoom, and what are they doing if they're not on Zoom. The need for control that some employers obviously have, and it might be very legitimate, is turning to analytics. So you're getting like people analytics, which is one of these words that I don't really understand, but seems to be very popular nowadays. And that, in turn, I think will bring us to our next topic, which is workplace privacy. What do you think will happen with workplace privacy in the coming years?
I mean, this is an area where there is regulation, and there have been a number of different sort of court cases taking place, but it's still an evolving area. So I think we have a very good notion of, surveillance law and privacy in the purely private domain. So when I am sitting at home and I pick up my telephone to call you, Nicklas, the rules around who can intercept that call and why they can intercept it are very, very strict indeed. And there's very important thresholds. And if any sort of person tried to kind of intercept that private call, my employer or anyone else, that would be a really big deal, a criminal offense. Similarly, when I'm engaging with the company, if a service that I'm using is monitoring my activity as part of that service provision, that may be possible, but it's all going to be covered by GDPR in the case of Europe, or by other privacy rules, the California Privacy Act, etc. So there's a really robust framework there. Workplaces tend to be treated differently, and there's good reasons for that. But I don't think we've really bottomed out how far they should be, or workplace privacy rights should be afforded. So, for example, a private telephony system, or sort of one operated within a workplace, somebody else listening in on call, we all experience it every time you ring a customer service agent. It says this call may be recorded for quality and training purposes. If somebody's on a work phone, particularly in a call center, like, it's the norm that somebody can listen in at any point and record that call. So the opposite of domestic kind of privacy expectations. But what if it's not a call center? What if it's a general workplace telephony system? At what point, what's the threshold at which it would be okay to listen in to one of your employees' phone calls if they're using a work phone? Important question. To what extent is it reasonable to look at the emails they're sending if they're using a workplace email system? And again, most of us, I'm sure I did, I'm sure all of us did, you end up just for convenience using your workplace email system, often for, it could be quite sensitive things, your medical appointments, or, financial transactions you're doing. I don't know if anyone listening to this is pure enough to say they never ever did that with a workplace email system, but as I say,
certainly not.
So I say we all end up doing that. Now, at the same time, if your employer thought that you were emailing out the company's secret source code to another company, I think most of us was, well, it's reasonable then for them to look at it. But it's not reasonable for them to start looking at my private medical appointments. So all of this stuff, I think, needs to be addressed. So we do have legal frameworks that are relevant here, and certainly in Europe, as I say, there are a number of cases that people have taken where it could be the employee complaining about workplace surveillance, or it could be an employer sort of complaining that they're not able to do it. Either party could be taking these cases forward, but I don't think by any means it's settled. And again, I think this transition from a relative minority of people in a limited set of functions being the always-on people to many, many more people being always on and using these communications methods, I think is going to raise these questions or push them way up the agenda. There's just a lot more scope now for potential disputes where an employer does something that's inappropriate. Some of the things you mentioned, like surveilling the number of hours people are connected using different systems. Again, I don't think employers like the Facebooks and Googles were doing that particularly. They might have been doing some of this workplace investigation where they thought they had a serious problem and they were trying to investigate a leak or something. But I'm not aware that they were ever looking at how many hours were you on your different email systems, things like that. But as you move into a lot more jobs taking place online, and you may get employers who are suspicious that employees are claiming pay but not doing the work that they're being paid for, the employer is going to say, look, I think it's reasonable that I can do a certain amount of data collection because I feel I'm being cheated, and therefore I need to have the ability to investigate that. But again, what are the criteria? What's the threshold you've got to pass before that's reasonable? Is it reasonable for an employer to keep a log of hours connected of all of their employees all the time? Or is it only reasonable for an employer to do that where there are specific concerns that they can demonstrate? This is all the stuff I think that now will get worked out either under existing legislation, or maybe there will be new legislation that has to come into place in order to do this.
And because more and more people are working remotely, and more people are now in situations where they will have a camera paid for by the company that is in their home, and sometimes will catch family members as they walk across the background, and it's going to, I think, be this mix of home and workplace. The dissolution of the workplace into many different places is I think that's going to present an enormous challenge for not so much for the legislation. I think the legislation probably knows how to deal with this, and it's very uniformly saying that the rights of the individual come first. But it's going to be hard for companies to find ways in which they negotiate the new normal. And it's interesting one of the ways in which this happened at tech companies, and I don't know if you had this, but we had this entire department that did what they called people analytics. And so what they did was essentially looking not at any individual Googler, but at all Googlers. And the idea was just to find out, how are people doing? What are they eating? How can we sort of devise a healthier, more interesting environment for them, etc. And you were sort of living in this giant social engineering project, which I quite liked because I thought it was very funny. And you would find these things, they do small changes in your environment to sort of test things. And one of the things they did was that they put all of the really unhealthy candy at the bottom of the micro chicken, micro kitchen, sorry, not micro chicken, micro kitchen shelves. So they would put all of the really unhealthy candy. I mean, we were so spoiled. We had free candy, etc. But so there were lots of small things like that, and I think this will catch on, and that there will be like a group privacy problem. Because as an employee, should you, even if it's aggregated data, be open to be a part of an analytics project like that? And it brought a bit of sabotage. I mean, I was involved in a small group who did micro social sabotage and put the good candy on top because we thought people should have access to that. And at one point we shifted out the decaf and the caf espressos as well, which led to a really interesting work environment. But there's sort of that you resist, and when you resist, there's something happening there. There's something with the power. There's something with the relationship. And I thought it was really interesting that it came mostly when you see people engaged in this micro social sabotage resistance actions. It was related to what I think was mostly benign and certainly well intentioned people analytics ideas. Did you have that? Was that something you did?
I'm not aware that I was ever A/B tested for different forms of candy, but I may have been and just not known about it.
There you go.
Yeah, that would be the super sneaky version. But I think what's going to happen with those kind of things is, again, in line with the general principles of data protection and privacy law, that the employer, I think, is not going to be able to just assert that they're doing monitoring in the best interest of the employees and that's it. That they obviously know what's best. I think they're going to have to much more clearly demonstrate That's what they're doing. And again, that's a general principle of if you're using data, then you've got to prove or you've got to be able to demonstrate that it truly is in the interests of, or you're doing it in the interests of the people whose data you're collecting. You're not doing it arbitrarily. But again, we're back to this question. In my employment contract, what am I signing? Am I? And again, are those terms fair? Have I signed away? I mean, if I sign an employment contract to work in a call center, I am signing something that says I give my employer the right to listen in on all of my phone calls when I'm at work on the work phone. And now, you're right, that right is being extended to the call center worker who's working from their own home, which is a sort of novel aspect of that. But it's in the contract, you've agreed to that. So I think that a lot of things that may have been implicit before, kind of trust me, I'm the employer, I'm collecting this data for good reasons, may have to be much more explicit and much more sort of clearly consented to by people within the workplace.
I find when I think about this that I am probably on the German employer side. This might be because I'm Swedish and Swedes tend to do whatever the Germans tell us. But I think that sort of the reality is that I really like this idea that the driving vision here should be, what is work? How do we think about work? And should we not be working effectively and then spend time, our leisure time, with other things? And that as an employer, I would really like to have those workers who can get the job done and then can relax, because I know that over time they will be much more efficient. So if it's through the social partners agreeing with trade unions and employers associations, or if it's through regulation, as in the French model, this seems to be a really interesting solution. So let's assume for a second that we're fast forward 5 years. We have European directive on the right to disconnect, and this is something that it would be a bit of a revolution, because it would mean that the European Union had a mandate to walk into labor law in a way that it hasn't been able to do. But maybe it's connected with privacy, maybe an expansion, maybe some kind of agreement or code of conduct. If that were the case, we have a right to disconnect and it's negotiated between employers and employees. Would you think it is a good thing or a bad thing? What do you think the problems are, the challenges are?
Yeah, I mean, I could actually see it becoming an EU thing, because it could potentially be a single market issue, that those countries who are extracting every inch of their employees' time by not giving them the right to disconnect have got an unfair competitive advantage over the others. And so, like with working time directive, you need to intervene. So it's possible. I personally, I'd say I'm probably with you in the sense of liking the German model. I think it should be by agreement, because I think the most important thing is a conversation about workload, work allocation. You were right about attention, where you want people's attention to focus. Yeah. And in a sense, a badly managed organization is going to be the one that follows the sort of exploitative model. And again, let's keep going back to that. The thing that we are most concerned about is a bad employer underpaying its workers by getting them to work more hours than they really want to pay them for. And that's, for me, it sort of really all boils down to that. We should be really sort of crisp about that. And a good employer will not do that, and a good employer would agree. And it may be, again, old-fashioned notions of things like overtime. It may be that you don't want the right to disconnect necessarily. Sometimes you will want the right to disconnect. At other times, you want the right to be paid when you do connect. And so your solution, you might not want. And again, we had this discussion over the working time directive. You may, within your employment sphere, not want to be told that you have to disconnect at 6 in the evening. You may want to be given the right to insist that when you're called on the phone at 7, you can charge time and a half or double time, old school sort of overtime. But that's going to be teased out if you have these conversations between employers and others. Where I think you might want regulation, as I say, as a flaw, which says for those, I think, minority of employers who simply are seeking to abuse their workforce, there we need a regulatory flaw that says at that point, the employee has some ability to go to some kind of tribunal and flag that an abuse is taking place, and the abuse being that they're being asked to work unreasonable hours or being asked to work additional hours for which they're not receiving any kind of compensation. And again, a lot of employment law is framed around that. It's framed around people sort of behaving in an unreasonable and abusive way. So, for example, we talked earlier about a lot of the gig economy laws, certainly in the UK, and I think in other countries, they're all around what they call disguised employment. That somebody is effectively an employee, but you just don't want to pay them holiday pay and you don't want to pay them sick pay, and so you're cheating the system. But you look at the nature of their work, and their work looks like the work of any other employee, and therefore should be treated the same. So again, simply hours that you're working away from the normal hours, when you're sitting reading email, responding to email, or even worrying about the email that you've been sent, that is kind of disguised overtime. Frame it that way, and you should be getting paid for your disguised overtime, just like you should be given employee rights if it's disguised employment.
Yes, and it's interesting. I do think there are risks, though. I mean, to the question of what could go wrong, there is. If you look at the French legislation, it is only applicable to organizations that are above 50 people.
Yeah.
So you could imagine a world in which you get a lot of small outsourced companies that are 49 people, where there is absolutely no rights to disconnect, and where you get this kind of abuse. So I think that's why I like the agreement model, the German model, better than the French, because regulation always has these second order effects, these unintended consequences that create weird distortions of the labor market. So there's something to be said for the German model also being driven, at least to some extent, by the companies. Another thing about the German model that I thought was really funny was that the strictest agreement, its charter for its employees that give them the right to disconnect, is the German Ministry of Labor. Yeah. So they have put out this sort of agreement for all. So they've led by example, which I really like. I think there's something about that, and that's a way of norming, of sort of creating the norms for a market that is kind of attractive. I do think that we'll get much more of this, and I think we'll have much more remote work in the future. And so I think that both the question of, I mean, it was always be interesting to sort of turn it around and say, how much leisure time is it that you have a right to? What's your right to leisure? That's the sort of rather than the right to disconnect, which sort of makes work the central piece of your life. You could talk about this right to leisure. And leisure time is severely underestimated. I think we tend to think of it as time when we're not working, but that's not it. I mean, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, for example, a lot of people wrote about leisure time as the time when you cultivate yourself, or Justice Brandeis used to say that leisure time is when you're a citizen. That's when you're sort of participating in society and building democracy and devoting attention to the institutions that make up your liberty. That's leisure time.
So that means that politicians are permanently enjoying leisure time.
Well, I'm sort of the opinion that they are, and you would know better, but
the House of Lords, when they're having a little break on the screens, it says that the House is adjourned during pleasure. So I think we've got that down to a T. We adjourn, all of
perfect. I should have known that the House of Lords has got the right framing of this. But there's that thing too that I think is even more important. We talked about this before when we talked about misinformation. We're approaching technology from its disadvantages rather than looking at the values that we would like to protect, the values that we think are fundamental to democracy and perhaps to us as human beings. And if we were to start with those values, with the value of leisure time, we might get to a very different place, and we might actually be able to address this not by saying, we will configure your Microsoft Exchange server, but by saying, here's your cordon off time, and you do with it what you will, and it doesn't matter. This is what's protected. Yeah. And there's just something about that recurrent theme where we're reacting to technology again and again.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, in terms of the opportunities, again, we're at the threshold potentially of something very exciting, where previously for a lot of jobs, people were, schlepping miles on a tedious commute, going to an office that was not particularly lovely and didn't have all the snack bars that the Google offices had. It's just
if you have, to be honest, yes.
Eating a sort of expensive and not very nutritious lunch from wherever they can, get food nearby, and then schlepping home again. And now they may be kayaking to work or sitting in some beautiful place. And that opportunity is actually extended to a lot more workers. And again, call center workers would be the classic example of where now the ability to operate as a call center worker from home, if that can be done in a good framework, may lead to a much higher quality of life for that individual. And much better, for example, division of home and family responsibilities than when they were having to commute into a physical call center. And those are not sort of highly paid executive jobs. They're a much more sort of standard salary rate job. So there are these opportunities now, I think, for dramatically increased both sort of family opportunities and leisure opportunities that can be combined with work simply by breaking the geographical link between the job being done and the place where you need to be in order to do that work. I'm also super conscious. I mean, UK is a prime example that so many jobs were London only. You know, if you wanted to get on in life, you had to do it in London. And now a lot of those employers will be hiring people in other more beautiful parts of the country where people want to live. You know, people would be leaving family, leisure, the lifestyles they liked, and moving to more cramped accommodation in a more stressful environment just because they had to in order to get these jobs. And if we break that link again, potentially the technology is super positive as an enabler. If we can get this right. So we get back to your message. Let's look at the opportunities as well as the downsides in order to get the full picture.
Yes. Well, I think that's an excellent note to end on. How are you disconnecting this weekend?
This week, actually, so I have to stay connected. This is the other bane of our lives. We don't talk about this, which is delivery. As people who are friends of mine will know, I've been working on fixing up my house. When you fix up your house, you need to get a lot of stuff delivered. When you get stuff delivered, and again, I assume other countries are the same, it's like the message telling you the day the delivery is happening, the message saying the time slot during which it's happening, and you've got to be there, and you've got to be like super connected all of the time.
And the time slot is between 9 and 4 in the afternoon. And it's
we may call you an hour before, and if we don't get hold of you, the delivery is not going to happen, and then the whole So actually, that would be a bit of technology I would love. Is the thing, if I could figure this out, the thing that moves all the work stuff off to and again, we should have separate devices, but it moves all the work stuff off, or the stuff I don't want, to one place. And then the genuinely urgent stuff, which is the delivery of the new fridge freezer that I need to get into my house, that only that stuff comes through on a particular communication channel. But again, if people have got the solutions are there, technically it's not a technology thing, human level. I think very few of us have managed to disaggregate effectively. So,
well, best wishes for the delivery, and I hope that works out well. And if you have thoughts or ideas or anything, please get in touch with us. And you can find this podcast at Richard's website, which is
www.regulate.tech.
Thank you so much, and tune in next week for a new episode of Regulate the Tech.